Welcome to Campfire Tales. This week's Campfire Tale is a delightful little story about absurdity and foolishness, but really it's about the paradox between wisdom and foolishness. Because if we can't laugh at the world and ourselves, then we're all pretty doomed anyway, right? So here is the tale of the Three Sillies. Once upon a time, there was a farmer and his wife who had one daughter, and she was being courted by a gentleman. Every evening, he would come and see her and stop for supper at the farmhouse. The daughter was sent into the cellar to get beer for all of them. One evening, she had gone down to get the beer and happened to look up at the ceiling and saw a mallet stuck in one of the beams. It must have been there a long, long time, but somehow she had never noticed it before. And she began thinking it was very dangerous to have that mallet there. She said to herself, suppose my suitor and I are to be married, and we were to have a son, and he grew up to be a man, and came into the cellar to get the beer as I am doing right now, and the mallet fell on his head and killed him. What a dreadful thing that would be! She put down her candle in the jug and sat down and began to cry. Well, her mother, father, and suitor began to wonder what was taking her so long. So her mother went down to see after her and found her sitting on the floor crying, the beer running all over the floor. Why, whatever is the matter? Asked her mother. Oh, mother, she said, look at that horrid mallet. Suppose my suitor and I are to be married, and we were to have a son, and he grew up to be a man, and came into the cellar to get the beer, and the mallet fell on his head and killed him. What a dreadful thing that would be. Oh, dear, dear, yes, that would be a dreadful thing, said the mother, and sat down beside her daughter and began to cry. After a bit, the father began to wonder why they hadn't come back up. So he went down to the cellar to look after them himself. And there they sat, crying, beer running all over the floor. Whatever is the matter? He asked. The mother repeated the worry that her daughter had started, and the father frowned. Dear, yes, that would be dreadful, said the father, and sat himself down beside them and began to cry. Now the gentleman got tired of being in the kitchen by himself. So he went down to the cellar, and there he saw the three of them, side by side, crying, the beer running all over the floor. He turned the tap off and said, whatever are you three doing, sitting here crying, letting the beer run all over the floor? Oh, said the father, look at that horrid mallet. Suppose you and our daughter were to be married, and you had a son, and he grew up and came into the cellar to get the beer, and the mallet fell on his head and killed him. And all three started crying worse than before. But the gentleman burst out laughing. He reached up, pulled out the mallet, and said, I've traveled many miles, and I have never met three such big sillies as you before. Now I shall start out my travels again, and when I can find three bigger sillies than you, I will come back and marry your daughter. So he wished them goodbye and started off on his travels. After the gentleman had traveled a long way, he came to a woman's cottage that had grass growing on the roof. And the woman was trying to get her cow to go up a ladder to the grass, but the poor thing would not go. The gentleman asked the woman what she was doing. Why, look at all that beautiful grass on the roof. I'm going to get the cow up there to eat it. She'll be quite safe, for I shall tie a string around her neck and pass it down the chimney, and then tie it to my wrist as I go about the house, so she can't fall off without my knowing it. Oh, you poor silly, said the gentleman. You should just cut the grass and throw it down to the cow. But the woman thought it was probably easier to get the cow up the ladder than it was to get the grass down. So she pushed and coaxed and finally got her cow up on the roof. She tied a string around her neck, passed it down the chimney, and fastened it to her own wrist. The gentleman then went on his way, but he hadn't gone far when he heard the cow tumble off the roof. When he turned round to check on them, he was sad to see that the cow hung by the string tied round her neck. It had strangled her. Even worse, the weight of the cow that tied to the woman's wrist pulled her up the chimney, and she became stuck halfway up, smothered in soot. Well, that was one big silly. The gentleman went on and finally stopped by an inn to rest. The inn was so full that they had to put him in a double-bedded room, and another traveler was to sleep in the other bed. The other man was a pleasant fellow, but in the morning, when they were both getting up, the gentleman was surprised to see the other hang his trousers on the knobs of the chest of drawers and run across the room and try to jump into them. He tried over and over again and couldn't manage it. Finally, the gentleman said, "What are you doing?" "Oh dear," the other traveler said, "I do think trousers are the most awkwardest kind of clothing ever made. I can't think who could have invented such things. It takes me the best part of an hour to get into mine every morning. How do you manage yours?" So the gentleman burst out laughing and showed him how to put them on, one leg at a time. The other traveler was very much obliged to him and said he never should have thought of doing it that way. So that was another big silly. Then the gentleman went on his travels again and came to a village. Outside the village, there was a pond, and around the pond was a crowd of people. And they had rakes and brooms and pitchforks, and they were reaching into the pond. And the gentleman asked, "What is the matter?" "Why, the moon's tumbled into the pond, and we can't rake her out no matter how hard we try," a villager said. The gentleman burst out laughing and told them to look up into the sky, that it was only the shadow of the moon in the water. But the villagers didn't seem to believe him until one plopped right into the pond and began flailing about. Well, that's another silly. The gentleman went on his way and thought, maybe there are a whole lot more sillies bigger than the three sillies at home. So he returned to the farm, married the farmer's daughter, and if they didn't live happily ever after, that's nothing to do with you or me. All right, let's talk about the symbolism. So the mallet in the cellar is actually really the fear of the unknown. So the mallet hanging from the ceiling represents unconscious fears, irrational anxieties that have not yet been confronted. And the daughter's reaction is an extreme form of projection. So she imagines a worst case scenario, fearing something that hasn't happened and may never happen. And this reflects how the psyche often externalizes the hidden fears into imagined situations rather than, facing the present reality. And rather than removing the mallet, she fixated on the imagined tragedy. And not only that, but then brings her family into it, which is the next symbolism. The three members crying, family members crying, is an example of the contagion of irrational fear. So the mother and father immediately adopt the daughter's fear and irrational beliefs. And it mirrors the psychological phenomenon where fears, anxieties, and delusions are often socially reinforced rather than questioned and broken down. And in many ways, this also can be seen as a representation of generational trauma or irrational family beliefs that are passed down. Instead of questioning the daughter's logic, the parents uncritically accept and embody it, furthering strengthening the delusion. However, the boyfriend, the outsider, provides the necessary perspective to actually break the cycle of irrationality. And this suggests that sometimes external perspectives and logical intervention are crucial for dismantling these irrational fears. Now, the suitor's journey. By declaring that he will find three bigger fools before returning, he's unknowingly embarking on this fool's journey type of adventure. On the surface, it seems like he's trying to validate his belief that the girl's family is extremely foolish. However, as he meets these people, he realizes that foolishness is actually a universal trait and it presents differently in different people. And ultimately, what he realizes is that there's no escaping the foolishness, there is only recognizing it. Now, the three sillier people, each one represents a different imbalance in the psyche. So the woman with the cow on the roof represents this distorted sense of control. She believes she can outsmart nature by putting the cow where the grass is rather than bringing the grass to the cow. And her obsession with doing things the hard way is often a representation of the psyche's tendency to overcomplicate things and self sabotage. The man jumping into his trousers is symbolic of habitual ignorance and resistance to learning new things. He spent his life struggling with this task and gets trapped in the self defeating cycle. But the moment that the traveler tells him a different way, it suggests a liberation from this rigid thinking. The villagers fishing for the moon is symbolic of the trap of collective delusion. So, this it represents the collective ignorance and mass hysteria that we see in many cultures. And it also mirrors reality in terms of psychological tendencies like groupthink, superstitions, and misinformation. Now, the return and the marriage is ultimately a uh, realization of human nature. True wisdom is not found in eliminating foolishness, but in recognizing and embracing it and trying to dismantle it. He realizes that he can't get rid of foolishness, but he can bring light to it. And again, at its core, this story plays with the paradox of wisdom and foolishness. And Jung also spoke of this idea of the wise fool, someone who fully embraces their ignorance is actually the one that's closest to the wisdom. Everyone is foolish in some way, but the true self awareness is in recognizing and integrating that rather than denying it. All right. I hope you enjoyed the story of the Three Sillies, and I will see you in the next campfire tale.